You're listening to the Huddle Up Podcast with Chad Jensen and Zach Kelberman. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com and sound off. And now it's time to drop some knowledge.
Welcome in, everybody, to the Huddle Up Podcast presented by Mile High Huddle and 24/7 Sports. I'm your host, Chad Jensen. With me, as always, is my partner in crime. You know him, you love him, as your Denver Broncos reporter for 24/7 Sports. He is Zach Kelberman. Zach, we're kind of in that weird lull moment, that little window of time where it's the calm before the storm. And even though free agency doesn't officially open till Wednesday, tomorrow is when the legal tampering period officially opens. So things are about to get bonanza.
Right. This is like Christmas Eve for football fans. I mean, free agency in all regards starts tomorrow. By Wednesday, the big rush will be over. The agreements, the news, the rumors going to start flying tomorrow morning. We should have a ton, Chad, to talk about and report on. That's where we're kind of splitting these pods up a little bit. And we're making one tonight and one tomorrow to address the news because we're going to have a lot to talk about.
Yep. That's right. We don't want to we don't want to record something one evening for the next day, and then by the time you guys get the pod the next day, there's all this news, and it's no longer, not necessarily irrelevant, but you want to hear about the news, not necessarily what was on everyone's mind the day before. So this week we're kind of changing things a little on our end behind the scenes. So you guys should notice it, but it should allow us to be on the cutting edge of what's happening as best you can as a podcast that publishes once a day. So what we're going to do today is, because we're in the kind of calm before the storm, we're going to go through and address what's on y'all's mind. We're going through a Twitter mailbag version of the Mile High mailbag. But first, a couple of quick matters of business. You guys make sure you're following the show on Twitter so that you can get in on these rare moments in which we go to our listeners on Twitter and ask for your questions or what's on your mind, or ask for your participation in the show. Also, the best way to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening with the show in real time, at Huddle Up Pod. Also, props to everybody who has taken our calls to action to heart and pulled the trigger on your creative review, rating the show on iTunes. Now, we understand not everybody who listens to the podcast does so through iTunes. And so for those of you who don't, it's okay. You know, if you're not an Apple user, you're not an iTunes user, it's okay. There are other ways you can help support the show. Wherever you listen to the show, always leave a review, always leave us a comment, rate the show as best you can. But especially if you're on iTunes, you guys, you have to take some time really quick and go leave us a 5-star rating, review the show, give us your thoughts. Zach and I appreciate it, and you have no idea how much that helps us grow and reach new listeners and compete with other shows in this same realm on iTunes. It's really easy to do. Take some time. Just a couple weeks ago, in fact, before Zach and I left for the Combine, we were sitting at around 80-something reviews on iTunes. We kept hammering that home to you guys, and you came through big time. We're now well into the triple digits, but we want to get to 200. We're sitting in the low 100s. We want to get to 200 and be the highest reviewed, most reviewed, highest rated Broncos podcast on iTunes. And you guys can make that happen. You're the only ones who can make that happen. So, end of sermon, but take some time, get that done for us. All right, Zach, let's go through the Mile High Mailbag Twitter version, go through and see what's on the mind of the listeners today. Again, calm before the storm, so we're going to get what's going through your minds and address that, break it down for you. This one here comes from JT on Twitter, at JThomas89. We'll start us off, Zach. He says, we really need to have a home run this offseason, with the Raiders splashing on elite talent and the draft capital they have, and the Chiefs being the Chiefs. We're in trouble of being at the bottom of the West for many, many years. So we'll probably talk more about this. I'm sure it's on the minds of listeners in the mailbag. This probably won't be the first time it gets brought up. So let's just jump into this at the top here. Antonio Brown was dealt to the Oakland Raiders, which was one of the, everyone kind of knew that was telegraphed that the Raiders were going to be one of the main suitors for Antonio Brown. The Niners were up there. There were a few other teams that were involved in that, but the Raiders won out. So Antonio Brown gets himself a nice, shiny, fat new contract, Zach. But more importantly, Chris Harris Jr. has the one player, the one opponent he has struggled with traditionally. Not every time he's faced the Steelers, but that, I think back to that one game in 2015 where he got torched for 2 touchdowns by Antonio Brown, and they were the first touchdowns he'd given up in coverage in something like 2 calendar seasons. So now he's in the AFC West with Derek Carr. It gives the Raiders a potent weapon. What are your thoughts, at least starting this off, on Antonio Brown coming to the AFC West?
It doesn't move the needle for me at all. I don't see this as a major win for Oakland. I see this as a major win for Pittsburgh in a sense of getting rid of a disgruntled player and getting something back for him without cutting him. They still have Derek Carr. They keep trading away key pieces of that roster. They just traded their best interior pass blocking lineman today. And if you can't keep the quarterback upright, what's the use of having an all-pro receiver? I mean, they traded away Amari Cooper, and you have a lateral move in a sense with Antonio Brown. So I'm not scared. Juju Smith-Schuster did more damage to Denver last year than Antonio Brown. So it's a receiver like that scares me. Not a 31 going on 32-year-old who is kind of going to be entering twilight soon. And for 2 games a year in Oakland, who's a tanking franchise before they get to Las Vegas, it doesn't scare me personally. I think Fangio and that defense, they can do enough to combat that.
I was just going to say, if the trade would have included Ben Roethlisberger, I'd be tripping a little bit more. But I mean, on its face, yeah, you have to respect that the AFC West now has a perennial All-Pro wide receiver for Chris Harris and company to contend with, and you got to face that. But at the same time, you got to recognize that, and maybe Antonio Brown hasn't and won't fully appreciate this until he gets to Oakland, but there's the chicken combo, right? The effect that's a term most fantasy football players know, that you got the quarterback and the wide receiver. That particular, if you get the right chicken combo, it can be very potent. And Antonio Brown benefited greatly from playing with a Hall of Fame quarterback. I mean, let's face it, Ben Roethlisberger, he's headed for the Hall of Fame when he hangs up his cleats. So now he arrives, Brown, in Oakland, and not to take anything away from Derek Carr, who has had, I think he's been to 3 Pro Bowls in his very young season, but his last 2 campaigns have been, let's face it, extremely lackluster. And everything we've seen so far from all empirical evidence, his team up here with John Gruden has not been a smashing success yet. I say yet because, Gruden's obviously playing the long game here, tearing this thing apart to rebuild it in his own image, based on his vision. But I'm not as worried about this as maybe some fans are, because Ben Roethlisberger's not coming with him.
Right. And, Chad, speaking of Derek Carr, when we went to the Combine, we rolled up the first day a little late. We came in, we right as Mike Mayock started talking. And the first question that we heard about was quarterbacks. And what jumped out to me was that he went out of his way to praise Kyler Murray, Drew Lock, Dwayne Haskins, but he was kind of non-committal on Derek Carr. I'm still not convinced Carr is going to be the starting quarterback next year. So if Brown hated catching passes from Ben Roethlisberger, what is he going to think catching passes from Drew Lock or Kyler Murray? So it's a ticking time bomb there. It doesn't scare me. That move in Oakland is going to help the Broncos. It's going to self-destruct in Oakland's face. It's going to be kind of a double agent kind of thing for them. I'm more worried about the Chiefs in this division because they have a quarterback who's going to be a Hall of Famer, it looks like. They have game-breaking threats on every level. That defense is getting patchwork. It's getting better. That team is going to be sticking around. And even the Chargers with Phillip Rivers. But the one team that doesn't scare me and the one player that doesn't scare me are the Raiders and Antonio Brown.
Right. And, and that's a fair point. But we also have to recognize that even though it was the Vance Joseph regime, the Raiders beat the Broncos. They split, their games last year. So
let's see with better coaching. That's all.
Sure. And I'm with you on that. I think that's, the Broncos are going to be, just by virtue of their coaching change, leaps and bounds ahead by next year. But, yeah, again, on its face, Antonio Brown, not that threatening coming to the AFC West, because the quarterback he has throwing the ball to him now is just not the same caliber of distributor of the ball that Ben Roethlisberger was. He doesn't take as many chances vertically. He's not as accurate with his deep ball, and that's really where Antonio Brown makes his money. So it'll be interesting. But let's get back to his other point here, Zach, in that what he's really getting at, JT, is that the Broncos, they need to make some splashes this offseason. You got to contend with the Chiefs. Also, you got the Chargers that are still a very talented, very deep team led by a veteran quarterback. So I think the Broncos have taken some pretty major steps forward in terms of splash. It maybe has not been the most enthusiastic response, but getting Joe Flacco into the AFC West. The Ravens have basically traded back and forth with the Steelers for the AFC North ever since Flacco came to the NFL in 2008. So I think the Broncos are going to field a much more competitive team in 2019. Doesn't mean they're going to be able to necessarily win the AFC West, but I think you're going to see a pretty, let's just call it a quantum leap forward in 2019 where you're not going to see the Broncos getting blown out. You're not going to see the Broncos. Games like the one against the Chiefs, both games against the Chiefs, but let's mainly focus on that Week 4 game in which the Broncos had the opportunity to win that game late, but shoddy quarterback play and some questionable coaching at times in that game caused the Broncos to come up short. You can say what you want about Joe Flacco, but one thing that the dude has in spades is he's clutch in the red zone and he's clutch when the chips are down. So that should benefit the Broncos. We got Fangio coming in to have this defense keep teams like the Chiefs, from scoring their average. They're holding them by usually, even the Broncos last year under Vance Joseph, they were holding teams, high-scoring teams like the Rams and the Chiefs, well below their average points per game. So you bring Fangio in, you expect that to continue, if not get better, at least on defense. And then all that means is as long as it's a one-score game going into the fourth quarter, now you've got Joe Flacco, and we'll see what they do in the free agency. We'll see what they do in the draft. But that gives them a big leg up over last year.
And you talk about a home run offseason. To me, that's subjective. They're going to be aggressive. Elway and company will be on the phones now, but really when the tampering period opens, they're not going to be like 2014, that aggressive, but they will make plays to address major roster holes at corner, at safety, tight end, inside linebacker. They're going to get some players on the open market. I foresee at least one splash player, like a Landon Collins, C.J. Mosley, Adrian Amos. One of those guys will come to Denver, and they're going to fill holes. And then we'll use that to go BPA in the draft, whoever they take there. But the one thing Elway will not do, regardless of the moves teams make around him, is panic. He's going to stick to his guns. He's going to stick to his plan. He has his guys he wants in free agency. He has his guys who he wants in the draft at number 10 in the first round. He's going to stick to that. So Antonio Brown, those trades can happen. It's not going to rattle Elway in that sense. He has too much pride, too much ego to go away from what he does best, and that's, in his mind, scouting talent and rebuilding this roster.
Yeah, fair point. Let's move on here to a question from Dylan Von Arks on Twitter, at Arks, that's with an X, _D. Dylan says, what are our best options at cornerback in free agency and in the draft? With Antonio Brown in the mix, our secondary is going to need a boost. Now, even before AB came to the AFC West, we knew that cornerback was a massive weakness for the Denver Broncos. Outside of Chris Harris Jr. and a banged up, still coming off of a shoulder surgery, Isaac Yiadom heading into year 2. From there, it's a pretty massive drop off of a cliff in terms of talent. So the Broncos are gonna give some attention to their secondary, and that's going to start this week with free agency. But let's start with, he's wanting to know who are some of the options. All right. Let's start with free agency. Now, there are a few guys out there like Brent Grimes, you got Morris Claiborne, you got Brandon Carr, you got some names out there, but let me tell you a couple names I like in terms of fit with Fangio and under-the-radar types. First and foremost, I'm going with Pierre Desser, the kid from Indianapolis, who's just had, he had a couple of years there where he was kind of low-key under the radar. This last season, playing with the Colts, though, he really kind of stepped his game up and I think proved, or at least answered more questions, that he can be a consistent player on the outside. Because one of the names often thrown out when you talk about free agents that the Broncos could bring in is Bryce Callahan, the former Bear, former Fangio acolyte, etc. And while I respect everything that Callahan is, he's one of the league's better nickel corners. The Broncos don't need a nickel corner. They already have that in Chris Harris. They need bona fide outside guys who can match up to what Fangio likes to do. And I'm telling you that Pierre Desser is one of them. Another guy, he's under the radar, and he's an injury-prone player. But sometimes it's really weird, man. You start talking about football karma and things like that. Sometimes just changing cities, changing geography can affect a player positively. And one guy I think might be worth a flyer in that regard is Jason Verrett, formerly of the LA Chargers. But who do you like in free agency at the corner position?
Well, the most obvious one is Bryce Callahan from the Bears, with the Fangio connection, the Donatel connection. Right. He is an elite slot cornerback, but Chris Harris Jr. does want to move outside more, so that would give them an opportunity. And they just need corners at this point. They need healthy bodies. They just move one to wide receiver. So Callahan, to me, that's the obvious one. Even though I think Amos is a more realistic target in free agency than Callahan, he's definitely the name. Kareem Jackson, also from Houston, can play safety corner. Great veteran player. And another guy I like a lot is Ronald Darby from the Eagles, big outside corner. I think he might re-sign with Philly, though, but he's the number 2 guy on the market behind Callahan to me. So those 3 guys, starting with Callahan, the guys they should target.
Some other under-the-radar veterans include former first-rounder Darqueze Dennard from Cincinnati. He's a guy that, for whatever reason, I think he was, much is made of the fact that he failed to make an impact in his first 4 years with the Bengals. But the way that Marvin Lewis kind of managed the cornerbacks, or allowed the cornerback group to be managed by his assistants, was questionable. They were really old at corner and chose to stay old at corner despite drafting high at corner. And so Dennard, and maybe, you read between the lines there that maybe that was his own doing. He wasn't doing enough to go up the depth chart, but I still see him as a player who can fit Fangio's kind of zone scheme, who can man up, in terms of playing some press man when needed, but he's primarily a zone guy. I think could thrive in that type of system with Fangio. But just under the radar guys, I think Zach landed on the main names as far as the A-type names. But again, I think if you're going to go out and spend, I'd rather the Broncos go spend on an elite safety like Adrian Amos.
Agreed.
And then go grab even 2 or 3 under the radar corners who can come in. I mean, Kevin Johnson's another former first rounder. The Texans just dispatched cut. So he's a street free agent. So if you sign Kevin Johnson, who's 6 foot, he's long, he can bring some length and some skill. He didn't work out with the Texans, but again, you try different things, you kick the tires in a different culture or different environment. Sometimes things stick. And Johnson's probably a player you could get on the relative cheap. So there are some names out there in terms of the draft. I mean, the Broncos are going to have some options. The main ones to consider are, I think, the kid from Washington.
Murphy.
Yeah, Byron Murphy. There we go. DeAndre Baker. So those are the 2 names most tied to the Broncos, at least early. But it's definitely, Zach, a position the Broncos are going to give some attention to here in the next 6 weeks.
Oh, yeah. I would not even rule out double dipping, maybe with 1 or 2 guys in free agency and using the number 10 pick on a corner. They need bodies badly. So another name to keep in mind, though, kind of a dark horse, is Tremaine Brock, because he did play with Fangio in San Francisco. So there is some familiarity. He would come cheap. He knows the system, or at least he knows the players. So that's one name. But yeah, in the draft, it's going to be either Baker or Murphy, because Greedy Williams isn't a great tackler, and that's one quality that Fangio seeks lot is tackling, called non-negotiable. So yeah, I could see them definitely double dipping, but number 10, it's either be Baker or Murphy if they go that route.
Here's one from Ian Darbs at Mango and Rice on Twitter. What would be the gut reactions if we got Jonah Williams or an offensive lineman at pick 10? And how deep is this offensive line class, barring the few big names? So for me, I would not appreciate the Broncos taking an offensive tackle or any offensive lineman at pick 10, just because I think that there are some options beyond round 1 that the team can take. And I would suggest you go back and read some of the draft content that milehighhuddle.com has published over the last 2 months since January. And there's some under-the-radar options. There's some deep options. In fact, Eric Trickle published an article on Sunday that's kind of his final mock 2019 offseason that mentions some names there that are deeper in the draft. So there's some options there, Zach. And just with the other needs that the Broncos have, specifically long-term franchise quarterback, corner, off-ball linebacker, I just would not be stoked if the pick were Jonah Williams.
Yeah, it's definitely not my first choice at all. But just to play devil's advocate to you, I could see why they would do it if Devin White's off the board, or corner's off the board, or quarterback's off the board. If that's their last guy and they really like Jonah Williams or another lineman, I mean, how hard was it for the Broncos to find a capable right tackle before Jared Valdir? I mean, how hard was it to find a left tackle before they drafted Garrett Bowles, who the jury is still out on? They don't have any developmental linemen really behind Sam Jones, one of the best coaches in the business, and Mike Munchak. I could definitely see it, and I would come around to understanding it. It just would not be my first choice at all.
Next question here comes from Paul, at Paul826, also a VIP subscriber at milehighhuddle.com, 24/7 sports. Paul says, Denver needs more draft capital and a drafted quarterback of the future soon. Still, in my opinion, we need to not overreact to what other teams are doing right now and stay the course. So I'm not sure exactly what he's alluding to there in terms of what other teams are doing. But yeah, John Elway has basically kind of walked back the perception that he's all in on quarterback this year at pick 10. And while I have my doubts and misgivings that there's truth to that, one thing I do believe is the trope that he recently put out, Zach, that he's not interested in moving up in the draft. So, in other words, if a Drew Lock or a Dwayne Haskins fell to him at pick 10, that's not off the table. He might take one of those guys, but he's not going to move up, sell the farm in this draft anyway to grab a quarterback. And barring one, if all the guys are gone at pick 10, there are other options later on. I wouldn't worry too much about it, Paul, because Jarrett Stidham is a guy, for example, the team seems to be really high on. And just this past weekend, Zach, I took some time to do a lot more film study on Brett Rippon. And if the Broncos were able to get him in the second round, I would not be shedding any tears. He's a fringe first-round quarterback with some really intriguing franchise upside, some tools there. So there's some options, but I think the Broncos do come out of this draft, whether it's in the first, second, or third round, with a quarterback of the future they drafted.
If Elway stays the course, then he won't move up. Elway staying the course is sticking to his guns and holding to the number 10 pick like he did last year. He didn't move up for a quarterback. Stayed at number 5. Bradley Chubb landed in his lap, and he benefited. And he had a great draft haul. So I think it's to be more of the same this year. Like you said, if Locke falls in his laps at 10, great. If he doesn't, there's plenty other blue chip prospects on the board. And I also agree, by round 3, they're going to have a quarterback on the roster, whether it be a Stidham, Rippon, Daniel Jones, Will Grier, anyone else in the first or third rounds. It has to be a QB. But they're not going to overreach. They're not going to panic. Elway's going to stick to his guns and stick to his draft board. And I don't see any major trades in the first round.
Still have a few more questions to answer in the mailbag. But first, you guys, we got to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
So the next question here comes from Michael Joe Hamby on Twitter, at Michael Joe Hamby. What are the chances, Zach, we sign John Brown and trade Emmanuel Sanders for more draft capital? What are the chances?
Probably nil, because Brown has the sickle cell trait, and that wouldn't be conducive to playing in Denver. And they picked up Emmanuel Sanders' option. He'll be ready for week 1. He's that burner type, so I'd rather have him on the roster than sign John Brown. So the chances are low they're going to do that. If they were going to do that and make a move there, they would have declined that option.
Eric Trickle floated a theory in that offseason mock he published on Sunday that I thought was interesting as it relates to Emmanuel Sanders and the fact that the Broncos did pick up that option, which I think guaranteed, what was it, $1.5 million, right? It was
right.
Of his salary. In that, what that really does and what that move was really about was creating more value for a potential trade partner. In that, look, if you take Emmanuel Sanders off our hands, we want a 5th round pick and maybe a 2020 conditional 5th round pick to go on top of that. You take Emmanuel Sanders, and he's going to need to finish his rehab. Hopefully, he'll be ready by opening week. But we also made it less costly on your end from a salary cap perspective, because we're taking away $1.5 million off his salary. So it's making it almost more attractive to other NFL teams to want to just say, you know what, it's worth the risk. Let's go ahead and pull the trigger on Emmanuel Sanders. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily reality, but it's an interesting theory. And what I would say is I probably differ with Zach a little bit on this. I still think that Emmanuel Sanders is very much, from what I've been hearing, on the table as a possible trade piece to take place between now and the draft. But it's also one of those things where I'll believe it when I see it, because he's injured. If he wasn't injured, I would almost guarantee that he was going to get traded this offseason. But because he's injured, it's going to cause those interested suitors out there on the trading block to go, let's kind of wait and see how free agency falls, or let's maybe wait and see how we feel about things a little bit closer to the draft.
That's exactly what I was going to say. If he didn't get injured, he would have gone on to finish a great season for him. He really rebounded after 2017, and he would have had a lot more trade value, and this would have been more plausible. But there's no guarantee he'll be back to previous form. There's no guarantee he won't have a setback. There's no guarantee for now he'll be ready for week 1. He hasn't even begun running yet. The offseason program starts on April 1st. So his value to me is minimal, is negligible right now, and I don't see any team willing to float compensation, even just a 5th or 6th round pick, taking on his contract, and a 31, 32-year-old receiver who's coming off a major devastating injury. That's just my feeling. I'm not reporting anything. I just think for now, Sanders is a good lock to make the roster.
Another team to consider, even though the word is that John Brown does want to be reunited with Flacco, despite the sickle cell, obstacle. The other team that's going to probably be in the mix for his services is Bruce Arians down in Tampa, who coached him with the Arizona Cardinals.
Much better fit, I think.
And probably is a much better fit, and without the altitude and the sickle cell complications. Right. So next question here comes from JD at Sports Talk 365 on Twitter. JD says, what's the most vital position the Broncos must address in free agency? What's priority number one, Zach?
It has to be the secondary to me. I mean, I just don't see a more glaring need than for a team that doesn't have a number 2, number 3 cornerback, and they just cut their starting safety. So to me, it has to be corner, has to be safety in that order, or maybe not in that order, but it has to be prioritized above anything else right now.
I don't disagree, but just for the sake of conversation, the other one up there for me. So I'd say number 1, I'm with you, is corner. Number 2 is off-ball linebacker. Number 3 is right tackle. Number 4 is safety. Now, the odd thing about that ordering or that list is that it's probably going to be a safety you're probably going to see get signed first, oddly enough. But I think the Broncos would be wiser to go after and kind of solve at least one of their cornerback holes, starting corners, get someone that you can count on and trust to start opposite of Harris, roll the dice on the next couple of days, see how things go with conversations with other free agents, and kind of bank on what Isaac Yiadom getting back to some health in time for the draft. But cornerback, to me, has to be number 1 top priority.
I just think for right tackle, they're in a pretty good situation because they can go after a guy like Juwan James. They can use a first-round pick on a tackle, or they can bring back Jared Valdir, who they're negotiating with and they kind of have in their back pocket. They're not talking with Billy Turner anymore, so maybe they're putting their focus on Valdir. So right tackle, to me, yeah, if we're listing them, it's definitely a priority. But in that secondary, Chad, when there's so many bodies missing now, I mean, I just don't think you can neglect it for that much longer.
Another name to keep in mind, too, which just recently hit the street. He's literally a street free agent. The Jaguars cut Jeremy Parnell, who was a more than serviceable right tackle.
They cut a lot of players.
They did, including Malik Jackson and including, Tashawn
Gibson. Yeah, great player.
So, Jeremy Parnell, though, keep an eye on him. Would not surprise me if the Broncos go, you know what, instead of paying $10+ million a year to Juwan James, we're going to go pay, $7 or $8 million for Parnell. Or maybe bring back Valdir. But next question here, we move on to Zachary because we're running low on time.
Great name.
On Twitter, at ZJCastro_94. He says, throw whatever money you can at Juwan James to solidify right tackle and then see if you can, with whatever is left, go get KJ Wright, since everybody will want CJ Mosley, fill cornerback with draft picks. So Zach's kind of reverse engineering what we just talked about in terms of priority. I love the idea of KJ Wright. In fact, the name Quan Alexander has been floated as kind of a backup option to CJ Mosley. But to me, the Broncos would be wiser if you can't get CJ Mosley to go after KJ Wright. The only holdup there is that he's coming off an injured season where he was plagued by injury.
I wouldn't mind Wright for sure, but you have Quan Alexander, you have Jordan Hicks, Perriman just got signed, you have Devin White in the draft, you have some players on the open market, you have even Aaron Lynch from the Bears, who Fangio just coached. So I would not throw crazy money at KJ Wright. I would not prioritize him. And same for Juwan James. He's no Joe Thomas at tackle. He's no sure thing either. So I would look into them, but I wouldn't just write them both a blank check when there's other alternatives out there in free agency and the draft.
Here's one from a great listener, Jedi Joshua 58. He says, Zach, what do you guys think about the best outcome signing-wise? What would that be? He says, I tend to agree with you guys 90% of the time, but I would like to hear it. So let's just say, we know the Broncos have, according to Spot Track, let's just say somewhere in the mid-30 millions, like 36, 37 million is what Spot Track has it listed at, over the cap, about the same. I've had some people tell me it's more in reality, closer to 34 million, but they have plenty of money. Now, just to give you context, that huge 2014 offseason in which Emmanuel Sanders, DeMarcus Ware, TJ Ward, Aqib Talib, all those guys were signed who went on to Pro Bowls and have huge impact on Denver's World Championship. That year, the Broncos had about $25 million in cap space to work with. So you can get really creative in terms of contracts. So having 34 or to 37 million available, let's just say today, to open up free agency, Zach, the Broncos are going to have some money to spend. So I'll serve this to you first. What do you think would be, let's just say, ideal signing, 3 names? What would be the dream signing for the Denver Broncos this coming week?
Well, first of all, keep in mind the Broncos are going to get about $4 million more when they cut Brandon Marshall, and they're going to have, Chad, plenty of money to spend. People think $40 million is nothing, but teams have $100 million, $90 million. 40 is still a lot. They can sign 2 or 3 quality free agents. In terms of the questions, though, let's say the 3 biggest names for the Broncos have got to be C.J. Mosley, Landon Collins, and either Adrian Amos or Juwan James. If they can come away with at least one of those guys, preferably 2, that's a win to me. And they have more than enough money to get at least 2 of those guys.
Let me try and do this the best way I can. So I'm going to say C.J. Mosley. This is the dream, right? Joshua, you're asking what the dream would be. The best outcome, the best case scenario. So I would say C.J. Mosley. I would say Adrian Amos over Landon Collins, despite the fact that Collins has that all-pro season a couple years in his rearview. So there's 2. My third guy would be
It's tough.
Corner. It'd be a corner. Who would I get?
Callahan.
I don't know if it would be Callahan for me. He's up there, but
The market's just so dry. I mean, you got Bradley Roby as one of the top options.
right. I'd probably go with Ronald Darby from Philly. To be honest with you, if I'm going the ideal corner, but that would be it for me. So hopefully that answers your question, Joshua. Next question here, and then we got to get out of here, you guys, comes from Juan Pablo on Twitter, at Broncos Brazil 1, a great Brazil listener. Juan says, if you had to pick, Zach, between Adrian Amos or Bryce Callahan, who would it be considering the Broncos' needs? And is there a chance we get both regarding salary cap, and is that a real possibility?
From a salary cap standpoint, they can fit both easily, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think one will stay in Chicago, more than likely Callahan, and I think Amos is the one that comes to Denver. He is the bigger need, the bigger priority, and he would be the better addition. Even though they don't have a corner, they still have the best slot corner in the business in Chris Harris Jr. They don't have any other safeties. And with respect to Will Parks, DeMonte Thomas, Stuart Cravens, they're not starting material. Adrian Amos is, and he thrived under Ed Donatel. He thrived under Vic Fangio. He would thrive next to Justin Simmons. The perfect complement to him, a massive upgrade on Darian Stewart. To me, it's a no-brainer signing. He can come in. It would be cheaper than Landon Collins. He's better in coverage. He can teach the players the defense on the field, can be a coach on the field. It's a no-brainer signing, and I would absolutely put him way above Bryce Callahan.
I don't disagree at all. I agree 100% that Amos would be the priority. I'm not as high on Callahan, not because he's not a good player, but because it'd be like, if you already have Von Miller, why do you go out and get,
Bradley
Khalil
Chubb?
Mack or, well, even Bradley, let's say both of them. It's like you already have, and nickel corner is even more specific than edge because you got 2, right? You need 2 edge rushers. So you can make sense of having Von Miller and going out and get Khalil Mack. From a nickel corner perspective, yeah, I understand that Harris is versatile and he can play outside just as well as he does inside, but he's more suited to inside. And why would you want to tempt fate? He's an elite nickel corner. He's the number 1 nickel corner in the NFL. Go spend that money on a player who can bring something additional to the table. And that's why I would go with a different option at corner. So I think Amos is going to be the more likely candidate of that duo to end up in Denver. Now, one last thing, then we're out of here. It's not from the mailbag. Zach, you reported on this on Sunday. Eric Weddle, who was released by the Ravens and then signed by Wade Phillips and the LA Rams, he went on the radio and said that, quote, here's what he said about Joe Flacco, which I think is interesting. And this is a guy who we got to remember, he's from the thin air. He played at Utah, so he knows all about the Rockies and the thin air. Plus, he played in the AFC West with the Chargers for the first half of his career. Here's what he said, quote, the guy's a true pro. He's a great teammate, and he's still got a bunch of years left. Being at Mile High with that arm and a system that fits Joe, I wouldn't be surprised if he goes on a run and you guys win a bunch of games. Close quote. Your thoughts on that, Zach?
My thoughts is my last little, paragraph of that story, and I'll just stand by that. I said anecdotes don't win games, and until there's more to go on, Flacco is merely an expensive Band-Aid applied by a franchise czar biding his time, still waiting to add that franchise quarterback feather to his cap. And I stand by that. And like I've said, until Flacco's on the field with the Broncos, until the Bulls start flying for real, he's still going to be that broken down 34-year-old who just got Wally Pitt by Lamar Jackson, a rookie who literally couldn't throw the ball. So I'm still a little negative on the trade. I would come around to it if given the right circumstances, but until that's on the field, I'm going to have my doubts.
Yeah, I mean, this is a guy who he's talking about one of his fellow Warriors, right? They went into battle together for 3 years in Baltimore, but I don't think he's too far off the mark. I think there's something to that. I think fans let me put it this way. I think that it's an underrated move, and just because, Flacco comes with all these cliches, is he elite, and he hasn't had a lot of success the last 3 years, fans aren't super excited, but I think this is a move that has the potential to be very underrated and pay some dividends for Elway and the Broncos over the next 3 years if they can solve some of these other roster holes and also pick up that franchise guy of the future because he is 34. But that's going to do it for today's episode of the Huddle Up Podcast. We'll be back, you guys, on Tuesday with some fresh insight and analysis on what took place Monday in the first day of the legal tampering period in the NFL and free agency. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, follow the show on Twitter at HuddleUpPod. Take your time. Leave a creative review. If you're an iTunes listener, absolutely crucial. Give us a 5-star rating. You can find my partner, Zach Kelberman, on Twitter at Kelberman247. Myself at Chad N. Jensen. Settle in, you guys. It's going to be a huge week, and we're looking forward to covering this and breaking it down for you guys on the podcast. In the meantime, for Zach Kelberman, I'm Chad Jensen. We'll talk to you soon.
You've been listening to the Huddle Up Podcast. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com to keep the conversation going.